dreams. The big friendly giant was seated at the great table in his cave, and he was doing his homework. Sophie sat cross-legged on the tabletop nearby, watching him at work. The glass jar containing the one and only good dream they had caught that day stood between them. The BFG, with great care and patience, was printing something on a piece of paper with an enormous pencil. "What are you writing?" Sophie asked him. "Every dream is having a special label on the bottle. How else could I be finding the one I am wanting in a hurry?" "But can you really and truly tell what sort of dream it's going to be simply by listening to it?" "I can," the BFG said, not looking up. "But how? Is it by the way it hums and buzzes?" "You is more or less or more right. Every dream in the world is making a different sort of buzzy, hummy music, and these grand swashbuckling ears of mine is able to read that music." "By music, do you mean tunes?" "I is not meaning tunes." "Then what do you mean?" "Human beings is having their own music, right or left." "Right, lots of music." "And sometimes human beings is very overcome when they is hearing wondrous music. They is getting shivers down their spindles, right or left." "Right." "So the music is saying something to them. It is sending a message. I do not think the human beings is knowing what that message is, but they is loving it just the same." "But that's about right." "But because of these jump squiffling ears of mine, I is not only able to hear the music that dreams is making, but I is understanding it also." "What do you mean, understanding it?" "I can read it. It talks to me. It is like a language." "I find that a little hard to believe." "I'll bet you is also finding it hard to believe in quagwinkles and how they is visiting us from the stars." "Of course I don't believe that." The BFG regarded her gravely with those huge eyes of his. "I hope you will forgive me if I tell you that human beings is thinking they is very clever, but they is not. They is nearly all of them not muchers and squeak peeps." "I beg your pardon." "The matter with human beings," the BFG went on, "is that they is absolutely refusing to believe in anything unless they is actually seeing it right in front of their own snozzles. Of course Quoggle Winkles is existing. I is meeting them oftenly. I is even chittering to them." He turned away contemptuously from Sophie and resumed his writing. Sophie moved over to read what he had written so far. The letters were printed big and bold, but they were very well formed. Here is what it said. "This dream is about how I is saving my teacher from drowning. I is diving into the river from the high bridge, and I is dragging my teacher to the bank, and then I am giving him the kiss of death." "The kiss of what?" Sophie asked. The BFG stopped writing and raised his head slowly. His eyes rested on Sophie's face. "I is telling you once before," he said quietly, "that I is never having a chance to go to school. I is full of mistakes. They is not my fault. I do my best. You is a lovely little girl, but remember that you is not exactly know everything yourself." "I'm sorry, I really am. It's very rude of me to keep correcting you." The BFG gazed at her for a while longer, and then he bent his head again to his slow, laborious writing. "Tell me honestly, if you blew this dream into my bedroom when I was asleep, would I really and truly start dreaming about how I saved my teacher from drowning and by diving off the bridge?" "More, a lot more, but I cannot be scribbling the whole group flunking dream on a tiny titch of paper. Of course there's more." The BFG laid down his pencil and placed one massive ear close to the jar. For about 30 seconds he listened intently. "Yes," he said, nodding his great head solemnly up and down. "This dream is continuing very nice. It has a very dorky, hunky ending." "How does it end? Please tell me," Sophie said. "You would be dreaming that in the morning after you is saving the teacher from the river, you is arriving at school and you is seeing all the 500 pupils sitting in the assembly hall and all the teachers as well.
and the head teacher's in there standing up and saying, I is wanting the whole school to give 3 cheers for Sophie because she is so brave and is saving the life of our fine arithmetic teacher, Mrs. Figgins, who was unfortunately pushed off the bridge into the river by our gym teacher, Miss Amelia Upscotch. So 3 cheers for Sophie. And the whole school is then cheering like mad and shouting, bravo, well done. And forever after that, even when you was getting your sums all gung swizzled and muggled up, Mr. Figgins is always giving you 10 out of 10 and writing good work, Sophie, in your exercise book. Then you is waking up. I like that dream. Of course you like it. It's a Fizz Wizard. He licked the back of the label and stuck it on the jar. I is usually writing a bit more than this on the labels, but you is watching me and making me jump seat. I'll go and sit somewhere else. Don't go. Look in the jar carefully. I think you'll be seeing this dream. Sophie peered into the jar, and there, sure enough, she saw the faint, translucent outline of something about the size of a hen's egg. Then there was just a touch of color in it, a pale sea green, soft and shimmering and very beautiful. There it lay, this small, oblong, sea green, jellyish thing at the bottom of the jar, quite peaceful and pulsing gently, the whole of it moving in and out ever so slightly, as though it were breathing. It's moving, it's alive, Sophie cried. Of course it's alive. What will you feed it on? It is not needing any food. Well, that's cruel. Everything alive needs food of some sort, even trees and plants. The wind is alive. It's just moving. It touches you on the cheek and on the hands, but nobody is feeding it. Sophie was silent. This extraordinary giant was disturbing her thoughts. He seemed to be leading her towards mysteries that were beyond her understanding. A dream is not needing anything, if it is a good one. It is waiting peacefully forever until it is released and allowed to do its job. If it is a bad one, it is always fighting to get out. The BFG stood up and walked over to one of the many shelves and places the latest jar among the thousands of others. Please, can't I see some of the other dreams? The BFG hesitated. Nobody has ever seen them before, but perhaps after all I is letting you have a little peep. He picked her up off the table and stood her on the palm of one of his huge hands. He carried her towards the shelves. Over here is some good dreams, the Fizz Wizards. Would you hold me closer so I could read the labels? My labels is only telling bits of it. The dreams is usually much longer and the labels just to remind me. Sophie started to read the labels. The first one seemed long enough to her, and it went around the jar, and as she read it, she had to keep turning the jar. And this is what it said. Today, I was sitting in class and I discovered that if I is staring very hard at my teacher in a special way, I is able to put her to sleep. So I keep staring at her, and in the end, her head drops onto her desk and she goes fast asleep and snorkles loudly. Then in marches the head teacher and he shouts, Wake up, Miss Plumridge! How dare you go to sleep in class? Go fetch your hat and coat and leave the school forever. You is sacked. But in a jiffy, I is putting the head teacher to sleep as well, and he just crumples slowly to the floor like a lump of jelly. There he lies, all in a heap, and starts snorkeling even louder than Miss Plumridge. And then I is hearing my mummy's voice saying, Wake up, your breakfast is ready.
What a funny dream, Sophie said. It's a ring beller, the BFG said. It's Wopsy. Inside the jar, just below the edge of the label, Sophie could see the putting to sleep dream lying peacefully on the bottom, pulsing gently, sea green like the other one, but perhaps a trifle larger. Do you have separate dreams for boys and girls? Of course. If I is giving a girl's dream to a boy, even if it's a really wopsy girl's dream, the boy would be waking up and thinking what a rot bungling, grink sludging old dream that was. Boys would. These here is all girl dreams on this shelf. Can I read a boy's dream? You can, the BFG said, and he lifted her to a higher shelf. The label on the nearest boy's dream jar read as follows. I is making myself a marvelous pair of suction boots, and when I put them on, I is able to walk straight up the kitchen wall and across the ceiling. Well, I is walking upside down on the ceiling when my big sister comes in, and she starting to yell at me, as she always does, yelling, "What on earth is you doing up there walking on the ceiling?" And I looks down at her and I smiles and I say, "I told you you was driving me up the wall, and now you has done it." I find that one rather silly. A boys wouldn't, the BFG said, grinning. It's another ring beller. Perhaps you have seen enough. Let me read another boy's one, the next label said. The telephone rings in our house, and my father picks it up and says in his very important telephone voice, Simpkins speaking. And then his face goes white and his voice goes all funny, and he says, "What? Who?" And then he says, "Yes, sir. I understand, sir, but surely it is me you is wishing to speak to, sir, not my little son." My father's face is going from white to dark purple, and he is gulping like he has a lobster stuck in his throat. And then, at last, he is saying, "Yes, sir. Very well, sir. I will get him, sir." And he turns to me and he says in a rather respectful voice, "Is you knowing the President of the United States?" And I says, "No, but I expect he's hearing about me." And then I is having a long talk on the phone saying things like, "Let me take care of it, Mr. President. You'll bungle it up if you do it your way." And my father's eyes is goggling right out of his head. That is when I is hearing my father's real voice saying, "Get up, you lazy slob, or you'll be late for school." Boys are crazy. Let me read the next one. Sophie started reading the next label. I is having a bath, and I is discovering that if I press quite hard on my tummy button, a funny feeling comes over me, and suddenly my legs is not there, nor is my arms. In fact, I has become absolutely invisible all over. I is still there, but no one can see me, not even myself. So my mummy comes in and says, "Where is that child? He was in the bath a minute ago, and he can't possibly wash himself properly." So I says, "Here I is." And she says, "Where?" And I says, "Here." And she says, "Where?" And I says, "Here." And she says, "Henry, come up quick." And when my daddy rushes in, I is washing myself, and my daddy sees the soap floating around in the air. But of course, he's not seeing me. And he shouts, "Where are you, boy?" And I says, "Here." And he says, "Where?" And I says, "Here." And he says, "The soap, boy, the soap. It's flying in the air." And then I press my tummy button again, and now I is visible. My daddy is squiffy with excitement. He says, "You is the invisible boy." And I says, "Now I is going to have some fun." So when I is out to the bath, and I have dried myself and put on my dressing gown and slippers, and I press my tummy button again to become invisible, and I go down to the town and walk in the streets, of course, only me is invisible, but not the things I is wearing. So when people are seeing a dressing gown and slippers floating along the street with nobody in it, there is a panic with everybody yelling, "A ghost, a ghost." And people is screaming left and right, and big strong policemen is running for their lives. And best of all, I see Mr. Grummett, my algebra teacher, coming out of a pub, and I float up to him and say, "Boo!" And he lets out a frightsome howl and dashes back into the pub, and then I is waking up and feeling happy as a whiff squiddler. Pretty ridiculous, Sophie said. All the same, she couldn't resist reaching down and pressing her own tummy button to see if it worked. Nothing happened. Dreams is very mystical things. Human beings is not understanding them at all. Not even their brainiest professors is understanding them. Has you seen enough? Just this last one, this one here. She starts reading. I has written a book, and it is so exciting nobody can put it down. As soon as you has read the first line, you is so hooked on it you cannot stop until the last page. In all the cities, people is walking in the streets, bumping into each other because their faces is buried in my book, and dentists is reading it and trying to fill teeth at the same time, but nobody minds because they is all reading it too in the dentist chair. Drivers is reading it while driving, and cars is crashing all over the country. Brain surgeons is reading it while they is operating on brains, and airline pilots is reading it and going to Timbuktu instead of London. Football players is reading it on the field because they can't put it down, and so is Olympic runners while they is running. Everybody has to see what is going to happen next in my book. And when I wake up, I is still tingling with excitement at being the greatest writer the world has ever known, until my mummy comes in and says, "I was looking at your English exercise book last night, and I really And really, your spelling is atrocious. So is your punctuation. That's enough for now, the BFG said. There is still billions more, but my arm is getting tired holding you up. What are those over there? Why have they got such tiny labels? Oh, that is because one day I is catching so many dreams I is not having the time or energy to write out long labels, but there is enough to remind me. Can I look? The long-suffering BFG carried her across to the jars where she was pointing to. Sophie read them rapidly, one after the other. I is climbing Mount Everest with just my pussycat for company. I is inventing a car that runs on toothpaste. I is able to make the electric lights go on and off just by wishing it. I is only 8 years old, little boy, but I is growing a splendid bushy beard, and all the other boys are jealous. I is able to jump out of any high window and float down safely. I has a pet bee that makes rock and roll music when it flies. What amazes me is how you ever learned to write in the first place. Ah, I have been wondering how long it would be before you asking me that. Considering you never went to school, I think it's quite marvelous. How did you learn? The BFG crossed the cave and opened a tiny secret door in the wall. He took out a book, very old and tattered. By human standards, it was an ordinary sized book, but it looked like a postage stamp in his hand. One night, I is blowing a dream through the window, and I sees this book lying on the little boy's bedroom table. I wanted it so badly. There, you understand? But I is refusing to steal it. I would never do that. So how did you get it? Sophie asked. I borrowed it, the BFG said, smiling a little. Just for a little time I borrowed it. How long have you had it? Sophie asked. Perhaps only about 80 years. Soon I shall be putting it back. And that's how you taught yourself to write? I is reading it hundreds of times, and I is still reading it and teaching new words to myself and how to write them. It is the most scrumdiddlyumptious story. Sophie took the book out of his hand. Nicholas Nickleby, she read aloud. By Doll's Chickens, the BFG said. By who? Just then, there came a tremendous noise of galloping feet from outside the cave. What's that? That is all the other giants, zip-fizzing off to another country to guzzle human beings, the BFG said. He quickly popped Sophie into his waistcoat pocket and hurried to the cave entrance and rolled back the stone. Sophie peeped out from the spy hole and saw all 9 of the fearsome giants coming past at full gallop. Where is you off tonight? Shouted the BFG. We is all of us flush blunking off to England tonight, answered the flesh lump eater as they went galloping past. England is a luscious land, and we is fancying a few nice little English tiddlers. I is knowing where there's a giggle house for girls, and I is guzzling myself full as a froth blower, shouted the maid masher. And I knows where there's a bottle box for boys, shouted the gizzard grouper. All I has to do is reach in and grab myself a handful. English boys is taking extra licky squishy. In a few seconds, the 9 galloping giants were out of sight. What did he mean? Sophie said, poking her head out of the pocket. What is a giggle house for girls? He is meaning a girls' school. He will be eating them by the bundle. Oh, no. And the boys from the boys' school. It mustn't happen. We've got to stop them. We can't just sit here and do nothing. There is not a thing we could do. We as helpless as horse feathers. He sat down on the large, craggly blue rock near the entrance of his cave. He took Sophie from his pocket and put her beside him on the rock. It is not quite safe for you to be outside until they is coming. It is now quite safe for you to be outside until they is coming back. The sun had dipped below the horizon, and it was getting dark.